As you know, for most of history, trains haven't been self-driven. Most commonly, they're operated by a 1 to 3 man crew depending on the circumstance. These crews have to pay attention constantly so they don't make a deadly mistake, such as missing a signal. When train crews are unable to comply with signals, dispatchers, or track warrants, it can have fatal consequences. And that's exactly what happened in Goodwell, Oklahoma, 12 years ago today. On Sunday, June 24th, 2012, a 2-man crew boards their train in Pratt, Kansas. This train is AAMMLX-22, an 80-car Union Pacific auto rack heading westbound to Los Angeles, California. Today, the crew handling the train are 49-year-old engineer John S. Hall and 34-year-old conductor Juan R. Zurita. There are 2 Union Pacific locomotives on the head end of this train, which are ST-70 ACE 8692 and ST-70M 4855, and 1 DPU in the back, which is AC-44CW 7215. The train departs Pratt at 5:32. What the crew didn't know is that their train would never make it to Los Angeles. AAMMLX-22, which we're now just referred to as the auto rack, was due to pass by one other train that day. This train was Union Pacific Intermodal Train ZLAAH-22, with 108 double-stack intermodal cars and 4 UP-owned locomotives. Leading the train were ST-70 ACE 8542 and ES-44 ACs 5482 and 7914, along with a DPU in the back, which was ES-44 AC 7735. The train originated in Los Angeles and was destined for Chicago, Illinois. After a crew change at Dalhart, Texas, the train was on its way. The crew of this train were 56-year-old engineer Dan J. Hall, not related to John Hall, and 49-year-old conductor Brian R. Stone. At the start of its journey, things went pretty smoothly for the intermodal. However, that wouldn't stay the same for long. The 2 trains are face to face. However, that doesn't necessarily mean they can't pass each other safely. The plan was to stop the intermodal on the main line adjacent to the Goodwell siding. Then the auto rack would pass around the intermodal using the siding, and after it passed, both trains would be on their way. At milepost 487.9, the intermodal train encountered a signal displaying the advance approach aspect, telling the crew to slow down the train and prepare to stop at the signal after the next. The train was required to slow to a speed of 40 miles per hour. However, like the Panhandle collision 4 years later, this did not happen. Instead, the train maintained speeds of over 60 miles per hour. At the east end of Goodwell siding, the train encountered an approach signal, meaning the crew would have to slow their train to 30 miles per hour and prepare to stop at the next signal. But this did not happen. Finally, the crew flew by the stop signal doing 65 miles per hour and still didn't slow down. The dispatcher saw the intermodal foul the red signal and attempted to contact the crews of both trains, but was unsuccessful. At the same time, the auto rack was approaching the siding doing 41 miles per hour. However, pretty quickly they realized that the intermodal train had already passed through the siding. Realizing a collision was imminent, the crew threw their train into emergency. Conductor Zurita then bailed off the side of 8692, and just then, it happened. At 10:02 a.m., the trains collided head-on, derailing all 5 head-end locomotives, 8 auto racks, and 24 intermodal cars. The combined speed of the collision was 79 miles per hour. The lead locomotives of both trains ended up on their sides, while the ones behind were crushed by the derailed cars. Due to the speed the intermodal train was going when it derailed, all 3 lead locomotives began leaking diesel fuel, and soon enough, the fire consumed the locomotives. Rescuers that had already arrived on the scene before the fire called in several more engines to help put out the flames. Despite their efforts, firefighters were unable to control the diesel fuel-fed fire. One firefighter was even brought to the hospital after suffering a heat stroke. It was known that conductor Zurita survived the wreck, as he was heard just moments later informing a nearby dispatcher about the crash by radio. He would be the only one to make it out of the crash alive. The rest of the crew members died by blunt force trauma or perished in the fire. Most of the rolling stock on the head end was completely destroyed in the fire, making the damage cost over $14.8 million. Once the wreck was deemed safe for investigating, the NTSB was quick to conduct an investigation. Investigating the wreckage didn't do much good for the investigators, considering that most of the equipment involved was destroyed in the fire. They did, however, manage to recover the event recorders from the third locomotive on the intermodal. According to the event recorder, the intermodal had passed by a total of 3 signals that weren't displaying clear aspects without stopping or even slowing down their train. The NTSB decided to interview Zarita, as he was the only survivor of the accident, to see what information they could get from him. He would say in his interview that his trip was relatively normal until his train passed an approach signal nearby Goodwell siding. This is about the time he and John Hall realized that Autorack had fouled the stop signal at Goodwell. After putting their train into emergency, Zarita decided to bail out, considering the fast speed the intermodal was going. The last time he saw Hall, he was still standing at the control panel. Right as Zarita bailed out, he heard an explosion, and that's when the collision happened. Afterwards, he would distance himself from the crash after noticing the fire, and then radio dispatch and emergency services. Realizing the collision was solely caused by the crew of the intermodal, investigators decided to look into the medical records of Dan Hall and Stone. Looking into Dan Hall's records, they found that he had apparently had vision problems for a few decades. This shouldn't have been an issue, considering that he did wear prescription glasses, but it was unlikely that anything else could have caused him to miss so many signals like that, especially considering that he had had a clean job record with the UP up until that point. It was determined that his vision likely deteriorated so much without anyone knowing that he was unable to see the signals at all. As for Conductor Stone, the NTSB never found a good reason for him to become unable to control the train, but because of the fire, we likely will never know. Also due to the fire, the NTSB was only able to perform a drug test on Zarita, and he was unsurprisingly negative. The NTSB concluded that the collision was caused by the crew of the intermodal, although the Union Pacific was also partially blamed, as despite their medical examinations, they couldn't determine that Dan Hall had any problem with his vision. According to the NTSB, a lack of positive train control also contributed to the accident, considering that if it was equipped on the head-end locomotives of the intermodal, the train likely would have stopped in time and prevented the collision. The wreck could have been prevented by one of 2 things. First is the implementation of positive train control on Union Pacific's locomotives. Positive Train Control, or PTC, is a satellite-operated system that intentionally stops trains that incorrectly respond to certain conditions, such as speed restrictions, signals, sidings, etc. To give you a better idea, if a train passes by any signal that's not green without taking the appropriate actions, passes over the speed limit at one section of track, enters an incorrectly set or occupied siding, or splits in half or uncouples at high speeds, PTC will automatically apply the emergency brakes of the train and won't release them until the train comes to a complete stop. If the Union Pacific conducted medical exams and possibly even drug tests more consistently and effectively, the accident may have also been prevented. In the end, all 5 head-end locomotives involved in the collision were destroyed in the fire and were never rebuilt. The DPU of the intermodal and the DPU of the Autorack were undamaged and returned to service. As of the making of this video, they are still both in service to this day. Almost all of the derailed cars were also unsalvageable and therefore scrapped on site. As for Juan Zarita, little to no information is given about his current status, but as of now, he's still alive and possibly working with the Union Pacific. It's been 12 years since the accident, and it's quite possible that the lessons of this collision may have been forgotten. In fact, a basically identical train collision happened 4 years later in Panhandle, Texas, when 2 BNSF intermodal trains collided head-on and caused a massive fire. The cause of that wreck was also the medical conditions of the crew of one train, affecting their ability to comply with signals properly. I guess history just repeated itself 4 years later. Even today, human error still causes head-on train collisions, like the Panhandle collision in 2016, or the Georgetown collision in 2018, or even the 2024 Folkston, Georgia wreck that happened pretty recently. Train accidents aren't always preventable, but we can take lessons from them and work to make them happen less often. Hopefully, with that in mind, we can eventually make accidents like this never happen again.